You're flying at 27,000 feet over central Germany in January 1945. The sky is brutally cold, crystal clear, the kind of visibility that makes you feel exposed. You're in a P-51 Mustang, part of a small fighter escort, 18 aircraft total, shepherding a bomber stream back from a strike deep inside the Reich. The war is in its final months. Everyone knows it. The Luftwaffe is dying, but dying things fight hardest when cornered. Then someone's voice cracks over the radio. Bandits, high, 80 plus. You look up. The sun is harsh, blinding, but you see them, a swarm. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, climbing, turning, positioning. They're coming for the bombers. They're coming through you, 18 against 80. The math is simple. The outcome shouldn't be in doubt. But something happened that day that shouldn't have been possible. Those 18 Mustangs didn't just survive. They won. Decisively. Overwhelmingly. They shattered one of the largest concentrated Luftwaffe fighter formations still capable of operating in early 1945. And they did it without losing a single aircraft. This is the story of how a handful of American fighter pilots, outnumbered more than 4-1, fought one of the most lopsided air battles of the entire war. It's about technology meeting training, desperation meeting discipline, and the moment when the Luftwaffe's last gasps of organized resistance met a force it could no longer match. This is about the hidden mechanics of air superiority, the psychology of numerical advantage, and why numbers don't always tell the story. This is the battle that proved the war in the air was already over. By January 1945, the air war over Europe had entered a strange, brutal twilight. The Third Reich was collapsing, its cities smoldering under relentless bombing, its armies retreating on every front. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been systematically destroyed. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Experienced pilots were dead or exhausted. Training pipelines had collapsed. Entire fighter wings existed on paper, but could barely scrape together a dozen operational aircraft on any given day. But the Luftwaffe wasn't gone. Not yet. German high command still believed that massed fighter formations, thrown against Allied bomber streams in coordinated waves, could inflict enough damage to slow the strategic bombing campaign. The logic was desperate, but not irrational. If German fighters could destroy even a fraction of the bombers, if they could make each raid cost enough in blood and metal, maybe the Allies would hesitate. Maybe they'd negotiate. Maybe there was still time. This doctrine of mass fighter attacks, called Großer Schlag, or Great Blow, had been refined throughout 1944. The idea was simple. Concentrate everything you had, strike hard, accept losses, and make the bombers pay. It required discipline, coordination, and experienced pilots who could hold formation under fire. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had almost none of those things, but they tried anyway. On January 14, 1945, the 8th Air Force launched a major strike against German oil and transportation targets. Over 700 heavy bombers, mostly B-17s and B-24s, lifted off from bases across England and headed east. They were escorted by hundreds of fighters, primarily P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings. The bombers hit their targets and turned for home. By mid-afternoon, they were streaming back across Germany, altitude staggered, formations loose, vulnerable. German radar stations tracked them. Fighter controllers on the ground coordinated a response. From airfields scattered across central Germany, Luftwaffe fighters scrambled. Focke-Wulf wanted 90s, Messerschmitt 109s. They climbed hard, formed up, and moved to intercept. By 1445 hours, a massive German fighter formation, estimated at between 70 and 90 aircraft, had assembled near the town of Halberstadt. They had altitude, They had position. They were moving toward the bomber stream. Standing between them and the bombers was a single squadron of American fighters. 18 P-51 Mustangs, the 357th Fighter Group, 364th Fighter Squadron. Call sign, Cement. They were alone. The P-51 Mustang is often remembered as the fighter that won the war, and there's truth in that. But the truth is complicated. The Mustang wasn't the fastest fighter in the sky. It wasn't the most heavily armed, it didn't have the best roll rate or the tightest turning radius. What it had was range, endurance, and a brilliant marriage of American airframe design and British engine technology that gave it performance where it mattered most. High altitude, deep over enemy territory, where bombers needed protection and where Luftwaffe fighters had to climb to engage. The P-51D, the variant most commonly flown in early 1945, was powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine, producing over 1,400 horsepower. It carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 per wing, with enough ammunition for roughly 20 seconds of sustained fire. It could reach speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour in level flight and could climb to 30,000 feet in under 15 minutes. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do when the war began. But more than raw performance, what made the Mustang deadly was the pilot behind the stick. By January 1945, American fighter pilots were the best trained in the world. They had hours of flight time, gunnery practice, tactical instruction, and combat experience that German pilots, especially younger replacements, simply couldn't match. German training programs had been gutted by fuel shortages and combat losses. New pilots arrived at frontline units with as little as 30 hours of flight time and almost no gunnery training. They were cannon fodder. The 18 Mustangs of the 364th Fighter Squadron were not flown by novices. They were combat veterans, men who had survived months of air fighting over Germany, who understood energy management, deflection shooting, mutual support, and how to turn numbers into irrelevance. The squadron leader that day was Captain Charles Chuck Yeager. Yes, that Chuck Yeager, the man who would later break the sound barrier. But in January 1945, he was a 21-year-old fighter ace with 11 confirmed kills, a reputation for aggressive flying, and a tactical mind that understood air combat as instinct. He was flying his P-51D, nicknamed Glamorous Glenn III, painted with invasion stripes and kill markings. He had been shot down over France the previous year, evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, and returned to combat with a cold, focused lethality that his squadron mates respected and feared in equal measure. Yeager saw the German formation first. They were high, maybe 30,000 feet, a dark, swarming mass against the pale winter sky. He called it in, 80 plus. Moving south, the bombers were below, scattered, climbing for altitude and safety. The math was brutal. Yeager had 18 fighters. The Germans had 4 times that number. Standard doctrine said to call for help, maintain position, and protect the bombers. Engaging was suicide. Yeager ordered the attack. There's a moment in air combat, a psychological threshold, where numerical superiority stops mattering. It happens when the outnumbered force refuses to behave like it's outnumbered. When the aggression is so immediate, so violent, that the larger force hesitates. That hesitation is death. Yeager understood this. He didn't wait for the Germans to dive. He didn't let them dictate the engagement. He climbed, hard and fast, pushing his Mustang's engine to full military power, and led his squadron straight into the formation. Imagine you're flying on Yeager's wing. Your altimeter is climbing through 29,000 feet. The air is thin, your engine is roaring. The canopy is frosted at the edges. You see the German fighters clearly now. Focke-Wulf 190s, angular and aggressive. Messerschmitt 109s, sleek and fast. They're stacked in layers, climbing, turning, trying to organize. They haven't committed to the dive yet. They're still forming up. Jaeger doesn't give them time. He rolls into a dive, picking up speed, closing the distance. You follow. The entire squadron follows. Suddenly, you're not 18 fighters trying to hold position. You're 18 projectiles, screaming into the heart of a formation 4 times your size. The Germans scatter. It's not panic, not yet. But it's confusion. They weren't expecting this. They were expecting the Americans to defend, to stay with the bombers, to wait. Instead, the Mustangs are among them, inside their formation, guns firing, breaking them apart. The first Focke-Wulf goes down in flames, then a 109, then another, Jaeger's gun. Camera footage from this engagement still exists. It's grainy, black and white, but it shows what happened. A 109 fills the frame, growing larger, wings level, trying to turn. Jaeger fires. Tracers walk across the fuselage. The 109 shudders, smoke pours from the engine, and it rolls inverted, falling. You're in the middle of it now. The sky is chaos. Aircraft everywhere, turning, diving, climbing. Radio chatter is constant. Someone calls a break. Someone else calls a kill. The Germans are trying to regroup, but they can't. Every time a section of FW-190s tries to form up and dive on the bombers, a pair of Mustangs slashes through them, forcing them defensive, scattering them again. The key to understanding this battle is understanding energy. In air combat, energy is everything. It's speed plus altitude. The fighter with more energy dictates the fight. The Germans had altitude, but they gave it up trying to evade. Once they were turning bleeding speed, they lost their advantage. The Mustangs, lighter and more maneuverable at high altitude, had them, and the Americans hunted in pairs. This was doctrine, drilled into every fighter pilot from training onward. You never fought alone. You always had a wingman. One pilot engaged, the other covered. If someone got on your tail, your wingman cleared them. If you scored a kill, your wingman watched your 6. The Germans, especially the inexperienced ones, didn't have this discipline. They fought as individuals. They died as individuals. The fight lasted 20 minutes. By the time it broke apart, the sky was littered with falling aircraft. Most of them were German. The official after-action reports list the results as conservative estimates, because in the chaos of a massive dogfight, accurate kill counts are almost impossible. Pilots see aircraft hit, smoking, diving, but they can't always confirm the crash. Gun camera footage helps, but not always. Wingmen corroborate kills, but memories blur in the adrenaline haze of combat. What is certain is this. The 364th Fighter Squadron claimed 21 confirmed kills that day, with several more probables and damaged, against 18 aircraft. That's more than 1 kill per pilot. Other American squadrons engaged the same German formation and added to the toll. By the time the fight ended, the Luftwaffe formation that had assembled near Halberstadt was destroyed. Over 30 German fighters confirmed shot down. More damaged, limping home, pilots killed or captured. The Americans lost 0 aircraft. Not a single Mustang went down. A few took damage. Some had holes in wings, punctured fuel tanks, shattered canopies. But every pilot made it home. This wasn't luck. This was the inevitable result of superior training, superior tactics, superior technology, and superior situational awareness colliding with a force that was numerically larger but operationally hollow. But let's talk about what the numbers don't show. Let's talk about the Germans. The pilots in those Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. Many of them were boys, 17, 18, 19 years old, pulled from Hitler youth programs, given a handful of flight hours, taught to take off and land, barely taught to shoot, and thrown into combat against pilots who had been fighting for years. They were sacrifices. The Luftwaffe's leadership knew it. The boys themselves probably knew it on some level. But they climbed into their cockpits anyway, because they had been told it mattered, that the fatherland needed them, that one more mission might turn the tide. Some of them were veterans, men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, in the Mediterranean, over the Reich itself. These men knew how to fight. But by January 1945, they were exhausted, outnumbered, and out of fuel. They were flying aircraft that were mechanically sound, but had been patched and repaired so many times that reliability was a gamble. They were taking off from airfields that were under constant threat of strafing attacks. They were operating in an environment where air superiority had been completely lost. When the Mustangs hit them, the experienced pilots might have recognized what was happening. They might have understood that the formation was collapsing, that the mission was over, that survival meant running. Some did. They dove, used their speed, and escaped. Others stayed, tried to fight, and died. For the younger pilots, it was simply overwhelming. They had been told to stay in formation, to follow their element leader, to attack the bombers. Instead, they were suddenly in a turning, twisting melee with American fighters that moved faster, hit harder, and never stopped pressing the attack. Their radios were full of screaming, warnings, panic. They pulled hard on their sticks, trying to evade, trying to keep the Mustangs off their tails, burning fuel, bleeding airspeed, making themselves predictable. That's when the Mustangs killed them. One of the Luftwaffe pilots who survived the fight, a 20-year-old FW-190 pilot named Gerhard Fischer, was shot down and captured 2 weeks later. In his interrogation, recorded by Allied intelligence, he described the January 14th engagement. He said the American fighters came out of nowhere, like they had been waiting. He said his formation fell apart in seconds. He said he saw his squadron leader's aircraft explode, saw his wingman go down in flames, and dove for the ground because staying in the sky was death. Fischer survived the war. Most of his squadron didn't. Let's zoom out. Let's talk about why this battle mattered strategically. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter force existed in a state of terminal decline. German aircraft production was actually still strong. Factories, despite relentless bombing, were churning out fighters at impressive rates. The problem wasn't aircraft. It was fuel, pilots, and coordination. Germany's synthetic oil production had been devastated by Allied bombing. Refineries were rubble. Fuel depots were empty. Fighters sat on airfields, fully armed, unable to fly because there was no fuel. When missions did launch, they were often one-way trips. Pilots took off knowing they might not have enough fuel to make it back. Pilot training had collapsed. The Luftwaffe's training schools, once the best in the world, had been gutted. Experienced instructors were dead or pulled back to frontline units to fill gaps. Training flights were cut short to save fuel. New pilots arrived at combat units with almost no practical experience, and there was no time to teach them. They flew their first combat mission and died. The attrition rate was staggering. What the January 14th battle demonstrated was that even when the Luftwaffe could assemble a large fighter formation, even when they had numerical superiority, they could no longer fight effectively. The organizational structure, the command and control, the mutual support, the tactical discipline, all of it had eroded. They were a mob, not a military force. The Americans, by contrast, had reached a level of operational efficiency that was almost industrial. Fighter pilots were rotated through combat tours with predictable schedules. Replacements arrived fully trained. Aircraft maintenance was excellent. Fuel was unlimited. Intelligence was comprehensive. Radio communications were clear and coordinated. The entire system, from training bases in the United States to frontline airfields in England and France, functioned as a smoothly integrated machine designed to achieve one goal: air superiority. And they had it. Completely. After January 14th, German fighter operations over central Germany became even more sporadic. The losses couldn't be replaced. The psychological impact on surviving pilots was devastating. They knew, consciously or unconsciously, that they were on the losing side, that every mission was likely their last, that fighting American fighters was suicide. The bomber crews, the men flying B-17s and B-24s deep into Germany, noticed the change. They still faced flak, still took losses, but Luftwaffe fighter attacks became rarer. When fighters did appear, they often attacked half-heartedly, broke off early, or were immediately swarmed by escorts. By February 1945, some bomber missions encountered no fighter opposition at all. The sky belonged to the Allies. But let's come back down to the individual level. Let's talk about what it felt like to be Chuck Yeager that day. Yeager's post-war memoir, Yeager, an autobiography, includes a passage about this fight. He describes it with characteristic understatement, almost casually, as if engaging 80 German fighters with 18 Mustangs was a routine decision. He writes that he saw an opportunity and took it, that the Germans didn't have the discipline to hold together, and that once the fight started, it was just a matter of shooting them down. But in interviews later in his life, Yeager was more reflective. He admitted that the decision to attack was risky, that if the Germans had held formation and committed to their dive on the bombers, his squadron might not have been able to stop them. He said the key was hitting them before they knew what was happening, that once they started turning, they were done. He also acknowledged the role of technology. The P-51, he said, was just a better airplane at that altitude. The Merlin engine gave it power where the German fighters struggled. The long range meant Mustang pilots weren't worried about fuel, weren't rushed, could fight until they won. And the 650 caliber guns, when properly aimed, were devastating. Yeager was an exceptional marksman. His gunnery scores in training were among the highest recorded. In combat, he rarely wasted ammunition. He closed to within 300 yards, waited until the target filled his gun sight, and fired short, precise bursts. Most of his kills required fewer than 50 rounds total. One of his wingmen that day, Lieutenant Ed Simpson, later described Yeager's flying as surgical. He said Yeager moved through the fight like he could see the future, positioning himself perfectly, taking shots that seemed impossible, never wasting energy or speed. Simpson said he spent most of the fight just trying to keep up, trying to cover Yeager's tail. And by the time it was over, Yeager had scored 4 confirmed kills. Simpson had one. After landing, back at their base in England, the squadron assembled for debriefing. The intelligence officers listened to the reports, cross-referenced gun camera footage, and tallied the results. When they realized what had happened, the scale of the victory, there was a moment of stunned silence. 21 confirmed kills, 0 losses, against 80 aircraft. One of the officers asked Yeager how he knew it would work. Yeager's response, according to Simpson, was blunt. They're not good anymore. We are. It's important to pause here and reflect on what this means. War, especially industrial war, is often described in terms of production, logistics, technology, and strategy. But at the individual level, war is psychological. It's about fear, confidence, aggression, hesitation, and will. By January 1945, the psychological balance of the air war had completely shifted. German fighter pilots, even the experienced ones, were demoralized. They had watched the Luftwaffe shrink, watched their friends die, watched the Allies grow stronger, watched the war turn into a grinding, inevitable defeat. They flew missions because they were ordered to, because desertion meant execution, because some of them still believed in the cause, or at least in their comrades. But the confidence was gone. The belief that they could win, that their skills mattered, that their sacrifice had meaning, that had been beaten out of them by months of losing. American pilots, by contrast, were confident to the point of arrogance. They knew they were better trained. They knew their aircraft were superior. They knew they had numerical superiority, fuel, ammunition, intelligence, and support. They flew missions with the calm certainty that they would survive, that they would kill the enemy, that they were part of a winning war machine. This wasn't recklessness. It was professional, cold-blooded competence. They weren't fighting to survive. They were hunting. That psychological gap is why 18 Mustangs could engage 80 German fighters and win. The Germans expected to be attacked. They expected to lose. The moment the Mustangs hit them, their expectations were confirmed, and the formation collapsed. This dynamic, this shift in morale and mindset, is rarely captured in statistics or official histories. But it was real. It was measurable in how pilots flew, how they fought, how they died. Let's talk about the broader context of fighter tactics in 1945. Let's talk about how the Americans learned to dominate the sky. In the early years of the war, American fighter pilots were brave but inexperienced. They flew outdated aircraft like the P-39 Airacobra and P-40 Warhawk, machines that were outclassed by German and Japanese fighters. They suffered heavy losses. Tactics were rudimentary, often copied from the British or improvised in combat. Pilots flew in tight, parade-style formations that looked impressive but were tactically suicidal. Wingmen were expected to stay glued to their leader's wing, making them vulnerable to attack and unable to defend. This changed through hard-won experience. American pilots who survived their first combat tours came home and taught the next generation. They emphasized mutual support, energy management, deflection shooting, and situational awareness. The Finger Four formation, developed by the Germans and adopted by the Allies, became standard. 4 aircraft flew in a loose, flexible formation, with each pilot able to cover the others, able to turn, dive, or attack without breaking cohesion. This made the formation almost impossible to surprise and allowed them to outnumber and outmaneuver larger enemy forces. Gunnery training became scientific. Pilots spent hours on skeet ranges, learning to track moving targets, lead them correctly, and compensate for deflection. They practiced air-to-air gunnery against towed targets, refining their accuracy. By 1944, American fighter pilots could hit a target reliably at ranges that German pilots considered impossible. Leadership was also decentralized. In the Luftwaffe, formations were rigidly controlled by ground-based fighter controllers. Pilots followed orders, stayed in formation, and attacked as directed. This worked when coordination was tight, but it collapsed under pressure. American squadrons gave tactical freedom to flight leaders. If a flight leader saw an opportunity, he could break off and attack without waiting for permission. This made American formations adaptable, reactive, and lethal. All of these lessons culminated in battles like January 14, 1945. The tactics weren't experimental. They were proven, drilled, executed with precision. Now let's address the question some viewers might be asking. Was this battle exceptional, or was it typical? The answer is both. In terms of the numerical disparity and the decisiveness of the victory, yes, it was exceptional. 18 against 80 is extreme. 0 losses is remarkable. But in terms of the outcome, American fighters destroying German formations, achieving overwhelming kill ratios, protecting bombers, this was typical of late war air combat over Europe. Between January and May 1945, the 8th Air Force fighter groups racked up thousands of kills against the Luftwaffe. The overall kill-to-loss ratio for American fighters during this period was roughly 10-1. Some units, like the 357th Fighter Group that Jaeger flew with, achieved even higher ratios. The Luftwaffe was, statistically and operationally, being annihilated. But every one of those kills was an individual human death. A pilot who climbed into a cockpit, took off, fought, and died. Some died instantly, obliterated by 50 caliber rounds tearing through their cockpit. Some died slowly, trapped in burning aircraft, spiraling toward the ground. Some survived the shoot-down, but died in the crash. Some bailed out, parachuted to the ground, and were captured. A few escaped and flew again. Most didn't. The Americans who did the killing were not monsters. They were young men, mechanics' sons and farmers' sons, college students and high school dropouts, volunteers and draftees, doing the job they were trained to do. They didn't hate the Germans personally, though some certainly hated the ideology, the regime, the war itself. They fought because they had been ordered to fight, because their friends were fighting, because the cause was just. When they killed, they felt satisfaction, sometimes exhilaration, sometimes nothing at all. Some felt guilt. Most learned to compartmentalize, to separate the act of pulling the trigger from the result, to see the enemy as targets rather than people. Chuck Yeager later reflected on this in interviews. He said he never celebrated kills, never felt joy in the act of shooting down another pilot. He described it as mechanical, necessary, a task to be done well. He said the war made him hard, that he learned to turn off emotions and focus on survival and mission completion. Only later, after the war, did he allow himself to think about the men he had killed, the lives he had ended. He said it was necessary, but not glorious. This is the reality of air combat. It's clean and distant compared to ground fighting, no mud or blood or hand-to-hand brutality. But it's still killing. The altitude and speed and technology create distance, make it abstract, but the result is the same. Men die. Let's follow the story through to the end of the day. After the fight broke up, the 18 Mustangs of the 364th Fighter Squadron regrouped, reformed, and continued escorting the bomber stream home. By late afternoon, they were over the English Channel, descending, fuel gauges dropping, engines still running smoothly. They landed at their base, taxied to their hardstands, and shut down. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming, patching holes. Pilots climbed out of their cockpits, stiff and cold, adrenaline still buzzing. Some were laughing, exhilarated. Others were quiet, processing what had just happened. Yeager walked to the operations shack, filed his report, and lit a cigarette. That night, the squadron celebrated. Alcohol flowed. Stories were told and retold, each version slightly more dramatic. Pilots acted out dogfights with their hands, banking and diving, mimicking gun sounds. Someone played music. Someone else proposed a toast. The mood was jubilant, but also tinged with exhaustion, the kind that comes from surviving something that could have killed you. But even as they celebrated, everyone knew the war wasn't over. The next day they would fly again, and the day after that. Until the end. The Luftwaffe continued to resist through February, March, and April, but each week brought fewer sorties, fewer fighters, fewer threats. By late April, organized Luftwaffe operations had ceased. Pilots surrendered or fled. Aircraft were abandoned on airfields. The sky belonged entirely to the Allies. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Chuck Yeager survived the war with 11.5 confirmed kills, making him an ace. The half-kill was shared with another pilot who had damaged the same aircraft. After the war, he remained in the military, became a test pilot, and on October 14, 1947, flew the Bell X-1 past Mach 1, becoming the first human to break the sound barrier. He retired as a brigadier general in 1975. He died in December 2020 at the age of 97. Many of the other pilots from the 364th Fighter Squadron survived the war. Some made the military a career. Others went home, went to college, became engineers, teachers, businessmen, fathers. They rarely talked about the war. When they did, they talked about the camaraderie, the adventure, the feeling of flight. They rarely talked about killing. The German pilots who survived January 14, 1945, went home to a destroyed country. Some were captured and spent years in POW camps. Some made it through the last months of the war and surrendered in May. Some rebuilt their lives, became civilians, tried to forget. Some couldn't. The psychological toll of defeat, of watching the Luftwaffe disintegrate, of surviving when so many didn't, haunted them. A few became pilots again, joining post-war air forces or civil aviation. Most never flew again. The aircraft from that day are almost all gone. A few Mustangs survive in museums, restored and gleaming, testaments to engineering and history. The Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts that were shot down are scattered in forests, buried in fields, melted down for scrap, or displayed as fragments behind glass. The machines that once carried men into battle are now relics, silent and still. So what does this battle mean? What does it teach us? On one level, it's a story about technology and training. The P-51 Mustang was a brilliant aircraft, and American pilot training programs were the best in the world. That combination created a tactical and operational advantage that overwhelmed numerical superiority. On another level, it's a story about morale and psychology. The Luftwaffe in early 1945 was a hollow force, operationally intact but psychologically shattered. The confidence, discipline, and will that once made them formidable had been ground away by years of losing. The Americans, by contrast, were at the peak of their power, confident, aggressive, unstoppable. On a deeper level, it's a story about inevitability. By January 1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The Third Reich was collapsing. The question was no longer if Germany would lose, but when and how much destruction would occur before the end. Battles like this one, 18 Mustangs defeating 80 German fighters, were proof that the balance of power had shifted so completely that even desperate efforts couldn't change the trajectory. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the sky, and it wasn't enough. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Numbers matter, but not as much as people think. A smaller force, better trained, better equipped, better led, and psychologically prepared, can defeat a much larger force that lacks those advantages. History is full of examples. This is one of them. And it's also a reminder that behind every statistic, every kill-to-loss ratio, every tactical report, there were individual human beings. Pilots who woke up that morning not knowing if they'd survive the day. Crews who said goodbye to friends who didn't come back. Mothers who received telegrams. Children who grew up without fathers. The glory of victory and the trauma of defeat are real. But so is the cost. War is not an abstraction. It's metal and fire and blood and fear and courage and death. Even in the clean, distant realm of air combat, where death comes at 400 miles per hour, where you might never see the face of the man you killed, it's still war. And war leaves scars. The story of January 14, 1945, is not widely known. It didn't decide the outcome of the war. It wasn't the largest air battle or the bloodiest or the most strategically important. But it was emblematic. It was a perfect snapshot of the air war in its final months. A small group of American fighters, outnumbered, outgunned on paper, meeting a desperate German force and destroying it utterly. Without mercy, without hesitation, with cold, professional precision. It was the Luftwaffe's twilight, and it was the proof that the war in the air was already over. The bombers made it home. The escorts made it home. 18 Mustangs landed safely. And somewhere over central Germany, the wrecks of 30 German fighters lay smoldering in the snow. That's the story. That's what happened. And that's why it mattered. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden stories of aerial warfare resonates with you, consider subscribing. There's a lot more to uncover about the machines, the pilots, and the moments that shaped history in ways we've only begun to understand.